I still remember the moment as if it were carved into my brain forever. I was 18, standing in my parents' living room, the air thick with tension and the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. My father leaned back in his chair, a smug expression plastered across his face. My mother avoided looking at me entirely, her eyes glued to the floor like she was ashamed I even existed. "You're worthless," my father said, his words sharp, precise, and devastating. "You'll never amount to anything. You can't even keep a job for more than a month. Why do you even try?" I wanted to argue, to yell, to defend myself, but I was frozen. I had always tried to please them, to live up to their impossible expectations. Good grades, part-time jobs, volunteering, even learning new skills, all of it meant nothing to them. That one sentence, "You're worthless," crushed years of hope in a single breath. I was barely out of high school, broke, and with nothing to my name. Every failure they accused me of, every mistake they exaggerated or invented, weighed on me like a mountain. I had dreams, big dreams, but in that moment I felt tiny, invisible, like a ghost haunting a house that had never wanted me. My friends were all moving on, going to college, getting their first apartments, driving cars I could only dream of. And there I was, standing in the living room of a house that had raised me but never truly supported me. A house where every accomplishment I had was dismissed, every ambition mocked. "You'll never make it in this world," my father continued, his voice rising. "You're soft, you're weak, you're a joke. You should just give up now before you embarrass yourself even more." I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I clenched my fists and told myself, "This isn't the end. This can't be the end." That night, I went to my small bedroom, the one room in the house that had ever felt like mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling a mixture of anger, humiliation, and determination. I had no money, no connections, and no safety net. But I did have one thing. I refused to stay broken. I scribbled in my notebook, "I will prove them wrong. I will rise. I will build something they can't ignore. I will never let anyone call me worthless again." Those words became a mantra. Every time they mocked me, every time my father shouted, every time my mother rolled her eyes, I repeated it silently in my head. "I will rise." The next morning, I woke up with a fire I had never felt before. I started small. I took on odd jobs, dishwashing, delivery, anything that would bring in a few dollars. Every paycheck was carefully saved, not spent. I didn't go out with friends, didn't buy new clothes, didn't indulge in distractions. Every cent went toward learning, toward building, toward preparing. I devoured books on business, entrepreneurship, investment, and leadership. I watched videos, listened to podcasts, and read every success story I could find. I learned how companies grow, how empires are built, and most importantly, how people who are told they're worthless can turn that rejection into power. School and home had taught me one crucial lesson. People like my parents will never believe in me. So, I couldn't wait for validation. I had to create my own proof, and slowly, with every small victory, a completed project, a satisfied customer, a smart investment, I felt a spark of confidence. By the time I turned 19, I had built a small freelance business in digital marketing. I didn't have an office, a team, or even clients I knew personally. I spent countless nights reaching out to strangers online, pitching my skills, doing work for pennies at first. But each project taught me something new. Each satisfied client became a reference. Each small success reinforced the idea that I could create value, even when no one around me believed in me. Of course, my parents noticed. My father scoffed when I told him I was starting my own business. "You'll fail. Just like everything else," he said. My mother muttered under her breath that I was wasting my time. Their words stung less now. Instead of breaking me, their doubt fueled me. By age 20, my small freelance work had grown into a legitimate business. I hired my first employees, two friends I trusted implicitly. I invested in better tools, better software, and more efficient processes. I learned the intricacies of managing people, finances, and clients. Every decision was mine, and I was finally accountable to myself. not to the dismissive voices of my family. I remember the first time I made more in a month than my father's entire paycheck. I didn't flaunt it, didn't send him a check with a note saying, "I told you so." I simply kept working, reinvesting, growing, and letting the results speak for themselves. By the time I was 22, I had scaled the business into a full-service digital agency. What had begun as late-night freelancing turned into contracts with companies across the country. I had staff, a growing reputation, and a vision for something bigger, a real empire. The same people who had mocked me, called me worthless, and dismissed my dreams were oblivious to the life I was quietly building. And every setback, every rejection, every cruel word from my past became fuel. They had tried to diminish me, to define me, and to stop me. Instead, I had used their disbelief as a foundation. While they spent their lives criticizing, I spent mine creating. I was no longer 18, standing in a room where my parents' voices were chains around my potential. I was 22, standing in a life I had built from nothing, and the empire I imagined in the shadows of my bedroom was beginning to take shape in the real world. But this was just the beginning. The small victories were important, but they were only the first step. My ultimate goal wasn't just financial success, it was proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the people who had called me worthless were themselves incapable of matching my ambition, resilience, and vision. I closed my notebook that night, now filled with strategies, goals, and projections. I looked around the small apartment I had rented, bare but functional, and smiled. They can't stop me. Not now. Not ever. That fire, that relentless drive, was just beginning to blaze. And when it did, the world, and my family, would finally see what being worthless truly meant. A label I had shed, replaced with power, independence, and unshakable success. The first years were brutal. They weren't just long, they were relentless. Every day felt like a battle against not just the world, but the version of myself that had been molded by doubt, ridicule, and a constant stream of "you can't." At 19, I was no longer the naive teenager my family had dismissed. I was an entrepreneur with nothing but a laptop, a small rented apartment, and a dream bigger than any fear I had ever felt. But dreams, I quickly learned, were worthless without execution. Every client I pitched felt like stepping into a lion's den. I faced rejection so often that it became normal. The words, "no budget," "we're going with someone else," and "we don't trust a freelancer that young," echoed in my head like a relentless drumbeat. I had two choices: let it crush me or let it fuel me. I chose the latter. My days began at dawn and ended long past midnight. I juggled 3 part-time jobs while building my digital marketing agency from the ground up. I delivered flyers at 6 a.m., worked my desk job from 9 to 5, and spent nights meeting with clients or learning advanced skills online. Sleep was a luxury. Food was whatever I could grab between tasks. Social life? Non-existent. But slowly, painfully, the foundation of my empire was being laid brick by brick. Every client I won was a victory. Every project delivered on time was proof that I was capable. But the real lesson came from failure. My first major contract was with a small local restaurant. They promised a 6-month retainer, which could have been a turning point for me. But the owner constantly changed their mind, demanded extra work without pay, and delayed payments. I learned to fight professionally, to negotiate, to set boundaries, and to protect my value. I discovered that in business, confidence wasn't arrogance, it was survival. By 20, I had a small but loyal team of 2 friends who shared my vision. We rented a tiny office, barely enough room for 3 desks and a coffee maker. But it was ours. We started landing bigger clients, local gyms, boutiques, and a few regional businesses that trusted us because of our dedication and drive. I wasn't just delivering marketing services, I was delivering results. And results don't lie. But the grind wasn't just about work, it was about mindset. Every insult my parents had hurled, every doubt they planted became a tool. I analyzed it, cataloged it, and used it to strengthen my resilience. Worthless wasn't a definition, it was fuel. Every time I felt like quitting, I replayed that living room scene. My father's smirk, my mother's dismissive gaze, and their words cutting deeper than any failure could. I refused to let them be right. At 21, I started diversifying. I knew that building an empire meant not relying on a single stream of income. I invested in small startups, learned the ins and outs of real estate, and studied financial markets late into the night. I wasn't just working for money. I was learning how money worked, how power worked, how influence worked. Knowledge was leverage, and leverage was everything. I remember one moment vividly. I had just closed a deal with a regional chain of fitness centers, the largest client I'd had yet. The check was substantial, not life-changing, but enough to validate my sacrifices. I sat alone in my tiny apartment, staring at the number on the contract, and allowed myself a small smile. I'm not worthless. I'm building something bigger than any of them ever imagined. By 22, my company had grown to a team of 10. We had recurring clients, contracts worth six figures, and a reputation for exceeding expectations. I had learned the power of networking, the importance of reputation, and the subtle art of negotiation. Every setback was a lesson, every failure a stepping stone. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Meanwhile, my family remained in their bubble of ignorance. They had no idea that the kid they had written off was now commanding clients, managing employees, and making decisions that affected hundreds of people. My father still muttered complaints about his own business struggles. My mother still complained about bills and minor inconveniences. They had no clue that the child they had dismissed was quietly building a life that would one day dwarf theirs. But the grind wasn't just about money or success. It was about strategy. I meticulously tracked every investment, every client, every opportunity. I reinvested profits into growth, hired the right people, and continuously educated myself. I learned that empires aren't built in a day. They're built in relentless, consistent, strategic effort. At 23, I expanded into real estate. I bought my first property, a small duplex that I renovated and rented out. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I leveraged that success to purchase another property and then another. I studied the market, learned to anticipate trends, and turned small investments into significant gains. By 24, I had a diversified portfolio, my marketing agency, rental properties, and stakes in promising startups. I was no longer just a young entrepreneur. I was a businessman with influence, vision, and control over my financial destiny. The world that had once seemed so large, so intimidating, was now a landscape of opportunities I could shape. And through it all, the memory of my parents' words remained a constant motivator. They had tried to define me, limit me, and suppress my ambition. Instead, I used their disdain as a compass, guiding me toward every decision, every investment, every risk I took. By 25, I had reached a point where my income surpassed theirs by a factor of 10. The tables had turned, but I didn't rush to gloat. I waited, I watched, I prepared. Because the ultimate satisfaction wouldn't come from mere success. It would come from witnessing the reality of their short-sightedness when it hit them like a storm. The grind had forged me into someone they could never dismiss again. I was no longer the 18-year-old they had called worthless. I was a man who had taken rejection, humiliation, and doubt, and transformed it into power, wealth, and influence. The empire I was building was not just financial, it was personal. It was a monument to resilience, intelligence, and determination. And I knew the final act was approaching. The moment when I would show them, definitively, that their words had no power over me anymore. That their judgment, ridicule, and scorn had fueled a fire that they could never extinguish. The grind had ended, but the reckoning was yet to come. By the time I turned 26, the world had started to notice. My small digital marketing agency, once run from a cramped apartment with a flickering desk lamp, had grown into a regional powerhouse. We had dozens of employees, high-profile clients, and contracts that crossed state lines. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was dominating. It wasn't luck. Every client, every contract, every new hire had been carefully calculated. I had learned the hard way that success wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. And every step I had taken, from scraping together pennies at 19 to late nights studying markets and client needs, had prepared me for this moment. I walked into my office one morning, the sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and glanced at the skyline outside. I had a panoramic view of the city, a city that had once seemed so unreachable, so intimidating when I was 18, and dismissed as worthless. Now it was mine to navigate, to conquer, to shape. But wealth and power alone weren't enough. I wanted more. I wanted influence. I wanted control. I wanted to build something so substantial that the people who had mocked me, the ones who had called me worthless, would have no choice but to recognize my success. It started with expanding my business into new sectors. I acquired a struggling tech startup that had potential but was mismanaged. Everyone told me I was taking a huge risk, that I was overreaching. I didn't care. I saw the opportunity, ran the numbers, and bought it at a fraction of its potential value. Within a year, the company was profitable, and the name Alex Carter began circulating in circles had only dreamed of entering. Simultaneously, my real estate investments flourished. Properties that I had purchased for modest sums were now appreciating rapidly. I reinvested every profit, leveraged assets intelligently, and diversified. My empire wasn't flashy. It wasn't about luxury cars or mansions, but it was solid, unshakable, and growing at an exponential rate. And yet, through all of this, one thought never left my mind: my family. They still lived in their bubble, unaware of the life I had built. My father's business struggled as always. My mother remained trapped in petty complaints and minor grievances. I knew that showing up too soon, too openly, would only satisfy a fleeting sense of revenge. I wanted more. I wanted a moment so striking, so undeniable, that they would have no choice but to confront the reality of my success. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. I had been eyeing an older, underperforming commercial building in the heart of the city. It was owned by a family friend, someone I knew casually, but the property had been neglected for years. Vacancy rates were high, tenants were unhappy, and the building's reputation was sinking. I studied the financials, inspected the property myself, and saw the potential. With calculated precision, I purchased the building. Then came the renovation, the upgrades, the marketing campaigns to attract high-quality tenants, and the management overhaul. Within months, the building was fully occupied, bringing in consistent revenue far exceeding expectations. I had transformed something overlooked and dismissed into a profitable, prestigious asset. And as I stood in the lobby on opening day, watching tenants marvel at the new design, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about showing off, it was about demonstrating capability. This was proof that when others said I couldn't, I could. When others mocked, I created. Then came the first confrontation. Though I didn't plan it, it just happened. My father walked into one of my office buildings for a meeting with a client, entirely unaware that he was stepping into my world. He hadn't seen me in months, and I hadn't bothered to contact him. I was immersed in work, orchestrating operations, leading meetings, and guiding my team toward another year of unprecedented growth. He froze the moment he saw me. The same man who had called me worthless, who had sneered at every ambition, looked suddenly small, unsure, and, most importantly, speechless. "Alec," he began, his voice faltering. I didn't know you were making it," I finished for him, my tone calm, almost conversational, not gloating, not threatening, simply stating a fact. The realization hit him like a wave. The same person he had dismissed, ignored, and mocked was now orchestrating a multi-million-dollar operation, managing dozens of employees, and handling high-stakes deals he couldn't even begin to comprehend. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was vindication. All those years of grinding, all the sacrifices, all the nights of doubt and struggle, culminated in this single moment. The boy who was called worthless was now the man who couldn't be ignored, but the ultimate test was yet to come. My mother and father had always prided themselves on appearances, on control. My success alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to witness the shift in power firsthand. That opportunity arrived when my father attempted to secure a business loan. He reached out to a financial consultant, unaware that I had a stake in the lending company evaluating his application. I received the notice and, after confirming the details, decided to handle it carefully, not with malice, but with precision. I scheduled a meeting with him, under the guise of routine consultation. When he arrived, he was confident, arrogant even, assuming he was still the one in control. But as I guided him through the process, explaining terms, interest rates, and projections, I subtly revealed facts he couldn't ignore. The numbers, the financial leverage, and the potential outcomes all pointed to one undeniable truth. The person he had dismissed as worthless was now the authority. His face turned pale. His bravado faltered. For the first time, I saw the exact emotion I had waited a decade for: recognition. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't belittle him. I simply let the facts speak. And in that silence, I felt the power shift entirely. By 27, I was no longer just an entrepreneur. I was an empire builder. My agency, real estate holdings, and investments had grown into a portfolio worth millions. My employees respected me, my clients trusted me, and the world took notice. And all the while, the people who had called me worthless at 18 remained trapped in the lives they had always known, small, constrained, and blind to the empire growing right under their noses. The rise had been slow, grueling, and sometimes painful, but it was unstoppable. And as I stood in my corner office one evening, watching the city lights flicker below, I smiled quietly to myself. The grind had paid off. The empire was real, and the reckoning, the moment when the world and my family would fully understand the magnitude of my success, was just around the corner. The next chapter wouldn't just be about proving them wrong, it would be about redefining the very rules they had tried to bind me with, turning their doubt into an opportunity for ultimate triumph. The moment I had been preparing for, the moment I had visualized for 10 long years, finally arrived. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was calculated, precise, and utterly undeniable. My empire was complete, and it was time to show the people who had called me worthless what real success looked like. It started with a family gathering that I didn't attend out of coincidence. I had been invited to a charity gala by a business partner, and when my father and mother casually mentioned it at a dinner they were hosting for distant relatives, I smiled quietly to myself. I decided to make my presence known, not as a guest, but as a force. I arrived at the gala an hour late, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit perfectly, exuding quiet confidence rather than ostentatious wealth. The room was filled with people who only half understood the reach and influence of my empire. My entrance wasn't met with gasps or applause. That was intentional. I didn't need theatrics. The impact would come from revelation, not spectacle. It wasn't long before I spotted my parents. They were at the center of a conversation, laughing, sipping wine, oblivious to the world I had built. And then they saw me. The look on my father's face was priceless. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. My mother's eyes widened and she clutched her pearls like a lifeline. The smug confidence they had carried all my life evaporated in an instant, replaced by shock and confusion. "Alex?" my father managed, his voice faltering. "What? What are you doing here?" "I'm here," I said calmly, "because it's time we had a conversation." I guided them to a quieter corner, away from prying eyes, and let the revelation begin. I pulled out my tablet, the one I carried with me for meetings, and opened a presentation. Charts, graphs, property portfolios, client contracts, revenue streams, all laid bare in front of them. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is the empire I've built over the past 10 years. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hands shook slightly. They leaned in, trying to absorb the information, but it was like swallowing a storm. Every business they had ever dismissed, every worthless label they had thrown at me, every insult, every doubt, it all came crashing down in front of them. Undeniable and undeniable. You built all this?" My father stammered, disbelief heavy in his voice. "All while you doubted me." I completed the sentence. "Exactly. You'll never make it, every insult, every moment of mockery, it fueled me. I took what you gave me and turned it into something bigger than either of you could have imagined. My mother tried to interject, to soften the blow, but I raised a hand, stopping her. Don't. Not now. Just look at it. I explained every step. The years of grinding 3 jobs, the agency I had grown from a small apartment, the strategic investments in real estate, the acquisition of failing startups, the reinvestment into sustainable growth. I detailed the empire in clear terms, numbers, and results they couldn't argue with. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. You called me worthless at 18, I said, locking eyes with my father. You said I would never succeed, that my dreams were childish and impossible. But here I am. And not just here. I am controlling industries, owning assets, and making decisions that affect hundreds of lives. The boy you dismissed is now the man you underestimated. My father's face was pale. My mother's lips trembled. The silence hung thick between us, heavy and suffocating. I let it linger. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to gloat. The silence spoke volumes. And then I dropped the final bombshell. Do you recognize that building? I asked, pointing toward the large commercial property I had recently acquired downtown. Their eyes followed my gesture, and they both nodded vaguely, unsure why it mattered. That's the one you were struggling to sell last year. I bought it, renovated it, filled it with tenants. It's generating more income in a month than your entire family business did in a year. The realization hit them like a thunderclap. My mother gasped. My father's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had been blind to my potential the entire time. I didn't do this to prove anything to anyone else, I said softly, letting my voice carry a calm authority. I did this to prove it to myself, but now, you get to witness it. You get to understand what happens when someone refuses to accept your limits for themselves. And more importantly, you get to understand what it feels like to face someone you've wronged and realize they've become unstoppable. I paused. Their eyes were locked on me, a mix of shock, fear, and dawning respect forming slowly. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. They were confronting reality, and it was brutal. And now, I continued, the quiet authority in my tone turning almost lethal, you are going to witness the final lesson. I handed my father a folder containing the legal documents for the downtown property, along with my business portfolio, showing that I now controlled the assets they had struggled with, the ventures they had thought they could manipulate, and the industries they had dismissed me from. My father's hands shook as he took the papers. His eyes scanned them, slowly comprehending the weight of what he held. My mother's hand trembled on his shoulder, unable to speak. You own all this? He whispered. I do, I said. And more. Everything I've built from scratch, from nothing but determination, skill, and focus. And yes, it's true. You underestimated me. But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I've proven to myself that I'm not worthless, that I'm capable of anything. And now, you've seen it too. There was no room for excuses, no room for denial. The evidence was in their hands. The empire I had built was real. The grind, the sacrifice, the sleepless nights, they all culminated in this moment. The child they called worthless had become the architect of a life they could not ignore. And then I delivered the final blow, not out of malice, but out of justice. Starting today, I said, my voice calm, deliberate, and precise. Anyone who doubts, disrespects, or underestimates me will face the consequences. You had your chance to support me, to guide me, and to believe in me. You failed. That doesn't mean the world will fail me, and it certainly doesn't mean I will let your words define my life ever again. My father's face turned a deeper shade of red. My mother could only nod, tears forming in her eyes. The reckoning was complete. I walked away from the table, leaving them with the weight of their disbelief. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was fulfilled. The empire I had built wasn't just for wealth or status. It was for proof. Proof that resilience, intelligence, and unwavering focus could transform a life. That night, I didn't celebrate with anyone but myself. I didn't need recognition or applause. The knowledge that I had overcome every obstacle, every insult, every doubt, that was celebration enough. The people who had called me worthless at 18 had finally learned the truth, and that truth was undeniable. I had turned their mockery into motivation, their doubt into a blueprint for success, and their rejection into an empire. They had underestimated me, but I had built an empire, and now they were powerless to stop me.